I wanted to start just with you, Administrator Neffenger. Obviously, in the springtime of this year, the system faced some real challenges. I mean, we saw it Midway and other places, Chicago, all around the country. We saw wait times. I think we all agree we've recovered nicely. But what would you say, kind of what happened? How did we get there? And then, more importantly, what were the lessons learned?
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I think that there's really a couple things. First is, you remember last year we faced, when I first came on board, we faced the challenges of the Inspector General reports, and we really needed to figure out what happened. I knew at the time that we did that we were going to have to slow some things down because we wanted to get better at the checkpoint. We were also facing a time in which we were coming off of a 4-year decline in staffing. So we were down close to 6,000 frontline people from 2011 to 2015. That's the number of reduction we had. We were facing another 1,600 or so in fiscal year 16 scheduled to go as a result of the budget. And so one of the first things we did was ask to keep those people, the 1,600 people, and then think about how do we need to grow back. So I suspected that we were going to have trouble meeting peak demand, and we were also growing at a higher rate of growth than had predicted in the budgets that we had put forward in the past years. So all that, I think, combined to give us an under-resourced approach in the face of a growing passenger volume, while at the same time we're trying to get better at what we did in the front line. And it got a little more intense than maybe some of us had hoped it would. But the lesson learned out of that was a couple of things. One, you do have to resource to meet the demand. TSA is integral to the efficient operation of the system, and you can't see it as standing aside from the system. So you have to be able to meet the demands of the system as it moves. So as the aviation system increases its passenger throughput, and the airlines and airports increase their staffing, you have to match that. The second thing was you have to operate differently. So we changed dramatically the way we operated. I think the lesson is that so I come from a military background. You operate from the operations end of the organization, the front end where the mission gets delivered, not from the back end. Otherwise, you're always chasing the thing that just happened. And you might be really good at fixing things, but you're not really good at predicting and keeping it from happening. So we flipped that around. You have to collaborate with your partners. So if you think of yourself as part of the system, that means you need to talk to the system. And so in addition to changing the way we operate, we established a command center focused on the approaches to checkpoints. Turns out you have to manage the approaches independently from the checkpoint itself. If you try to manage a line from the checkpoint, you don't do the job of the checkpoint very well, and you really can't fix the line. So we do that with now a daily phone call, and we track at the top 30 airports, which represent roughly 68 to 70% of the daily travel volume, the approaches, and we go airport by airport, airlines, airports, and TSA, and they match numbers, and they look to see what are they facing and what challenges do we have, so you can fix it in real time. And then finally, you have to think about transforming the system, because it's a system that has largely looked the same for a long time, and I don't think it's well positioned for the kind of growth we're seeing as well as the kind of challenges we see. So for me, the lesson was connect yourself to the system, do it in a way that is transparent and open up your books. There's very little that we do as a public agency that you shouldn't be allowed to look at. We've learned a lot from the airlines and airports, and I have to say thank you to the airlines and airports for providing close to 600 people to assist with non-security related duties this summer. That was tremendously important. So that's a little bit of a longer answer, but that's where we are.
Appreciate that, and we're going to tease out a little more of those themes as we move forward. But Gary, Southwest is known for putting a premium on customers and customer service. How was the spring wait time challenge for you all, and where do you think we are now?
Well, Sharon, yeah, it was very tough, and I applaud Admiral Neffenger. I think he recognized that quickly, and they really jumped on the problem. If you go back to the period leading up to Memorial Day, there were significant customer issues and a lot of complaints. There were long delays. Thousands of people missed their flights, so it was a very serious issue that needed immediate attention. And since essentially Memorial Day, that issue has dissipated. We get very high scores that we measure on the TSA experience from from our customers compared to where we were. And TSA is reporting daily on the top airports. So it's really remarkable progress in a very short period of time. I feel like the TSA has had the right vision of where we want to go with more risk-based security processes and procedures. We just haven't necessarily executed that vision, but made a lot of progress this year especially. So focusing on getting more customers signed up for PreCheck, which of course, again, that's the TSA vision and one that we support. There's been a major effort to accomplish that this year. The PreCheck line was not intended to be an elite line with very few people in it. It's actually the opposite. The throughput is far faster. So I applaud those efforts. I think that what we've done so far is working well. We're all concerned, I think, about the sustainability of it. And I'm sure you'll ask us some more questions, so maybe I'll just stop there.
Well, we will. We'll come back to PreCheck and some of those other sustainability issues. But I did want to ask you, Paul, you run a multinational security and company, and you do a lot of other things other than that. But you're here to bring us the private sector perspective. You watched all of this, both as a CEO, but also a member of the traveling public. What's your take on what happened and where we are now?
Thanks, Sharon, and Admiral, for being here today. Thank you, Gary, as well. My view from the private sector, which I heard various different positions this morning as to whether we were the bad guys or the good guys, or maybe the in-between guys, depending on how much profit you make, seems to be the real delineating factor. But when it comes to the TSA screening process, I think a challenge that anyone running a large personnel organization has is the collective bargaining aspect that in some cases puts some boundary lanes on how much realism we have in the ability to affect our staffing. We run 36 different collective bargaining agreements, and no two are the same with 36 different bargaining agencies. And what TSA has to deal with is extremely difficult at best, and I could probably say that more freer than the Admiral who's on the other side of it dealing with it each day. But to give you some examples of what I mean specifically, generally speaking, a private sector employee that goes into the screening process is going to work somewhere between 1,900 and 1,950 hours a year. The TSA group doesn't have that luxury. That collective bargaining agreement as it stands is somewhere between 1,680 and 1,710 hours. So right off the bat, what TSA is dealing with is a 15% differential on total working hours that are available. And that's driven in part by the collective bargaining as well as the federal guidelines that exist and have been negotiated. So if you start off with 15% negative to start with, and then you have that 15% being generated by what I would call liberal call-out policies and sick policies, that again TSA has very little room to help manage. You now have to have people stay, you have to hire more people to begin with, and you have to have people stay on longer than they should because of the call-out practices, which then raises overtime costs, which becomes a greater expense to the taxpayer. And what happens when overtime increases? Well, people aren't getting home on time, so morale starts to be directly affected. And when morale starts to be directly affected, well, then customer service starts to be directly affected. And this cycle keeps continuing. And I know that TSA is negotiating, the process of negotiating another collective bargaining agreement now. But these are real-world situations that, depending on what side you sit on, directly have an impact on Gary and us getting through to meet our airplanes on time. So I think it's a reality that we have to deal with and boundaries we have to try to work within.
Thank you, Paul. Gary had mentioned the idea of sustainability. Kind of now that we're in a much better place, how do we sustain that? And what are the programs do you think that TSA is and should be focused on to ensure that we continue to maintain wait times that are reasonable as they are now? And I'm thinking of a couple of things. I mean, obviously we've talked about PreCheck a little bit. I'd like to dig deeper into that. Obviously, the wait times that we saw, resulted in a nice bump up in PreCheck enrollees, but I think clearly still more needs to be done. So let's start there first, and then maybe we can talk about some of the funding issues. But if you can talk about PreCheck and then other programs that you think are important to ensuring that your agency's progress is sustainable.
Yeah, thanks. Well, PreCheck, you're all familiar with it, so you know what it is, and it really does look at risk-based security. The basic principle is the more we know about people, the less I have to be concerned about those individuals, and we can pay attention to the people we don't know much about. So the more people you can push into a so-called trusted or a known population, the safer the system becomes, or the safer we feel about the system. We had, about this time last year, we were about 1.6 million people in PreCheck. We're up around 3.5 million now. So we put a lot of effort into advertising. You do have to advertise to get people to pay attention to it. Some of the market studies that we did right after I first came on board showed us that we had very little market penetration anymore, because if you don't keep it in people's mind, it goes away. So we did that. We've worked very closely with associations, A4A, ACI, AAAE, the U.S. Travel Association, and others, to think about moving into other traveler loyalty programs to see whether there was opportunity to expand PreCheck, trading points and so forth. And for example, most of the major airlines now offer the ability to trade in frequent flyer points or miles for PreCheck enrollment. And so that's been very helpful. A number of the credit card companies and so forth. So that's expanded dramatically, and we've seen a huge increase in the number of enrollees. Again, when I first got into the job in July of last year, we were averaging around 3,000 enrollees a day. We're up over 12,000 enrollees a day on average right now. We've seen 19,000 enrollee days. Some of that was driven by some of the fear earlier in the summer, but now it's as you start to get volume into the system, people start talking to one another, and so we're getting much more. We've worked very closely with the current vendor to push more enrollment sites out, more mobile enrollment sites, more pop-up enrollment sites. We're hitting a lot of conventions and the like. Again, it's not as much as I'd like to see, but we've been driving it pretty hard just to get the capability out there. And then my personal goal is to make sure that wherever there's a PreCheck lane, it stays open and not open. And if it's not open, that you know the hours that it's not going to be open in some of the smaller airports. But the goal was certainly across the largest airports, that top 30 tier of airports, to make sure that there's always PreCheck availability. And then we roll open more lanes as we get more people in. So it's starting to grow at a compounding rate. So I'm very excited about where we're going. I think there's more we can do. I'd like to see us work across some of the other government programs like Global Entry, Nexus, and Sentry to conform some of that. I think it's still pretty confusing. It's confusing to me, and I'm supposed to understand this stuff. I go online. There's a number of different ways in which you can do this. We've simplified the enrollment process for PreCheck, and right now, if you want an appointment, you can typically find one within 14 days. You can do most of your application online now and then find it. So I think we're in pretty good shape in terms of where we currently are. I think there's much more to do. We'd like to expand the private sector opportunities.
Right. I was going to say that one of the things the Hill talks a lot about and was in the FAA Extension Act was this idea of a third party to help grow the program. I understand that's been, held up a little bit. Where do you think that is, and when do we think we can get it going?
Yeah, and I'll tell you what holds it up. I mean, so we do have a third party right now. There's a vendor that's providing the services. Some of what makes it challenging is there are a lot of privacy concerns when you start asking people to divulge information, and when you divulge that information in a way that provides it to a third party private sector entity. So you have to be careful that you don't inadvertently violate somebody's privacy act, like access to everything from credit records to other information. So that takes some time to work through the system. There's a number of gates that you have to pass through. It takes more time than one would think. So that's been part of the challenge. The second thing is to determine what is the best method then for expanding it. Do you want to see more retail, more online, combination of both? There are some people who say, look, I want to find it in the grocery store, or I want to see it at the post office, and others say, I never go to the post office or the grocery store. I want to be able to do it online. And it turns out that those are fundamentally different approaches to how you do it. So crafting the proposal, all that's out there now. And we're in the process of evaluating bids right now. So we hope that sometime in the near term that we'll be able to come out with a contract award for additional
Okay.
opportunities.
Paul, do you have any observations on PreCheck and third-party participation?
I sure do. I think the low-hanging fruit, there's tens of thousands of civilians like myself that have been in and around supporting the military, Department of Defense, as one example, where we're required to have background investigations and we carry top secret clearances as one example, or the Department of Energy equivalent of a Q clearance. So a thought would be if there wasn't a fast pathway for the civilian sector that's already been through OPM, that's already been through DSS, that's already been through DOD and all of the backgrounds, not to have to go through it again. I did, but there must be a way, if it's already been vetted through DOD and these other federal agencies, that could parlay over, as well as we've had several admirals as chairmen of our board, and they get in the same PreCheck that their admirals or generals that we've had. So the thought was, is there a way with senior law enforcement, senior military, even within DHS itself, senior DHS officials to kind of streamline the process and lever backgrounds that have already been done? Saves the taxpayers money, speeds up the process, and I think generates very little risk.
Yeah, actually, the good answer to that is that's exactly what we've done. So we've opened it up to cleared populations, so people who hold a current high-level clearance in the federal government. It's ingesting them is the challenge. So we had to work with. It's easy enough to do with Department of Defense, with Department of Homeland Security, and now Department of State. So those are the first three major departments that we provided for cleared people. The next was to go to cleared defense contractors and other cleared populations. And some of it is just identifying who holds those clearances, so, because you have to work with the clearance holder to get the information. And so now what we're in the process of doing is allowing you to identify yourself as somebody, if you want, as somebody who holds a clearance. Where does that clearance reside? Who's the holder of that clearance? And then just allow the transmission of the clearance data, and then you get PreCheck. So that's what we're hoping to expand that dramatically. That's picked up. Yeah, it's still a relatively small population, but it picks up another, million or so people. So that's a substantial number.
So Gary, I know that you've thought about this issue a lot too, and we've talked about it at Airlines for America. This idea of your employees who either have SITA badges or already have some type of background check. What's your sense of the PreCheck program? Do you think it can be expanded in these kinds of ways?
Well, you got Peter, Paul, and Gary, and I think we're all singing the same song up here, so well, probably pretty redundant. Yeah, I think trying to find large groups of people who pass a criteria that can be auto-enrolled or ingested, as Peter was saying, is absolutely a great objective. And I think that there's a lot of groups I think that they would want to vet, and we're absolutely proponents of that. Early on, of course, you had a lot of people who had to go through the same screening, and you just kind of shake your head on, well, why is that? So it just takes a while for systems to evolve, but I do think we've got the right leadership focused on doing that, and would absolutely advocate auto-enrollment.
Administrator, one of the issues that I've heard what you and Secretary Johnson have said over the last couple of weeks, as you've talked about kind of the shift toward the future, is some of your funding challenges. I mean, you've made the point that the way we turned this around, you turned this around, was a couple of things. You've said, TSA stepped up to the plate to improve collaboration. Carriers have stepped up to the plate with their own people. And of course, Congress stepped in as well and reprogrammed some money. But, one of the things that, we've talked about a lot is a concern because almost every administration, frankly, as they come out with a new budget, they come out with an increase in the 9/11 fee. So with that being kind of the context, what are your thoughts on the funding challenges? I mean, do you think you're going to be able to sustain the work that you're doing with your current budget?
Well, so there's a tactical piece to that, and then there's the bigger strategic piece. Tactically, I need to keep the people we just brought on board. So we hired about just under 1,400 new officers. We also converted close to 2,000 people from part-time to full-time. That's like bringing real people on board as well. We brought in a bunch of new dog teams on board, and we intend to continue to hire in. So I need to annualize that. We're working with the administration and Congress, and they're saying all the right things. We're getting good signals, strong support from the administration right now, and good signals from the Congress that they understand the need to annualize those things that we just have. So depending upon how we go forward, whether it's a short-term continuing resolution, I'd love to see a full-year budget. That's probably not going to happen. But at least if we get a short-term CR, I need enough money to keep those people on board. Otherwise, they all go home on October 1st, and that would be a bad thing. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think people, the right people understand that. The second thing is, okay, so you fix this year, and I think we'll get FY17 fixed, but then the problem comes back in fiscal year 18 and so on and so forth. So longer term, I think it goes back to my earlier comment that you have to understand that TSA is integral to the effective and efficient operation of the system. It needs to transform, it needs to modernize, and that's sort of a second project that we're working on, concurrent with maintaining the current system and trying to be more efficient with the current system we have. But you have to think about a way to sustain that into the future, so that if you fight annual budget battles on an agency that as I've discovered, is critically important. If we don't work well, if we're not efficient, then the system doesn't work very well. And it's more than just wait times, it's a security issue. First and foremost, for me, this is a security issue. The reason I care about the approaches to checkpoints is because large congregations of people are apparently attracted targets to those who would do us harm. I was in Brussels the morning that the bomb went off at the airport, and you just don't want that to happen here, and you don't want to present those kinds of targets. So how do you run the system efficiently, still do what you do, because you have to be effective. We can't let stuff get through. And so that requires, you have to think about it differently so that you understand that you have to fund it in a more consistent way. So from my perspective, in an ideal world, I want consistent, predictable funding over about a 5-year stretch, so that I know and I can plan for the changes that we need to put in place, the people that I need on board to bridge to what I hope to be a more efficient system in the future, and a more automated system in the future, one that takes advantage of existing technologies, and to do so in a way that energizes the private sector so that they're willing to invest the time and the effort to develop the products that I need. That's tough to do when you work 3 months at a time on a budget. So that's where I am.
Understood. Gary, again, this is something we face on an annual basis, whether it's from the administration's budget proposal or the Hill. It's this idea of increasing the 9/11 fee. What's your take on that, and whether it's necessary?
Well, and offer up thoughts, again, more obviously from the airline perspective, but just starting with the industry and the importance of aviation to our economy. Last time I looked, there are 15 million jobs in travel and tourism, and it has a huge impact, obviously, on the ability to do commerce in the United States and all over the world. So our government policies need to be oriented in a way that they support that objective, and just underscore the importance of aviation. And I agree with Administrator Neffenger. The TSA is an integral part of the customer experience, and that can't be ignored. Security is the #1 objective, and that is, of course, the overriding priority and very important. But you can't overlook the fact that it's also a part of the customer experience. And if we want to drive the economy, create jobs, create economic value and wealth for our country, it is vital that we get this right. So that means that the U.S. Congress needs to do its part. The system for aviation is already overtaxed. 20% of every passenger ticket goes to taxes. We've already seen significant increases in the 9/11 fee. The last increase did not go to fund the TSA. And in an environment where they are struggling with having adequate resources, that is very frustrating. So if anything, we need to redirect the money that we're already collecting from passengers to pay for this service and provide it for the service. Secondly, I think there just needs to be a realistic assessment, like Peter was describing, on what it takes to run this very important agency. And also just recognize that you may have a future vision on where you want to be, but you just can't get there overnight. So we need to be realistic about the people resources that we need. We're in the people business also in the airlines. There's significant effort involved with recruiting, with onboarding, with training, and then bear hugging those employees where hopefully they will see that as a career opportunity. And that is all very hard work, whether it's the public sector or the private sector. And there just needs to be adequate resources to support all of that. I've heard from Peter the obstacles that we face in all of those efforts, and we need to try where we can to break those down and just make it more efficient to get those people resources. And then finally, whether it's the airline or whether it's the government, things don't get done in a fiscal year necessarily. Things are long-lived, and there needs to be some confidence that we can see plans through, either with funding or with a program, so that we can have a vision for the future and consider new technology. So all of those things in my mind have to work together, but it really starts with recognizing that aviation is very important, and that as an element of that, security is very important, but so is the customer experience.
Great. Mr. Donahue, one of the tools in the administration's toolbox that got talked a lot about during the spring and summer was the screening partnership program. And I know our time is running, but we need to cover that, and then I want to get to innovation lanes and then a quick look at the future. So, but what's your take on SPP and how it's working and how can we improve it?
Briefly, SPP I think is a terrific program. I think security, a definition of security is free of care, but it's not free. So I'm one of those in support of the increase as long as it's directed properly, but I'm also a critic of how it can better be used. So the SPP I think is probably the best example of a more effective means where TSA maintains regulatory control, compliance to orders, but allow the private sector to compete for those. And where I'm critical is allow the airlines and the airports to also have a say on the procurement side, whereas today that doesn't exist yet. Internationally in other countries it does. So it brings more stakeholders into the voting process. They have more ownership to it, and ultimately under the CFR they have some level of responsibility as well.
Any thoughts, Administrator, on the SPP?
Well, for those, SPP, as you know, is a program that allows the federal government, for an airport that wants to go with a private screening force, they can ask to do so, they apply for it. It's a force that's still contracted back to the federal government, so it's a contract workforce back to TSA. There's a TSA Federal Security Director still there, but it would be a privately owned company that then runs a screening force. They're still trained at the TSA Academy, they're still trained to TSA standards, they have to work under TSA operating procedures. And I think that from my perspective, again, from a national security perspective, it makes sense. The federal government is responsible for the security of this nation, so I think that you need to have that federal oversight no matter who does it. But I would agree that it's a program that can work. It works well at the 21 airports that are currently doing it. We'll work with any airport that wants to come forward and ask about it.
Great. Quickly on innovation lanes and remote screening technology. I mean, we're trying to look forward now on technologies. How quickly do you think that you can get these innovation lanes up and going at other places, and what's the plan for that?
Well, and we've really started to think of this more as just innovation in general. The automated lanes are one example of some things we can do differently here, but we established an innovation task force in TSA this past year, and it's really, think of it as an incubation chamber for what in the Coast Guard we used to call future operations, but you've got to be able to think beyond what you're currently doing. The great challenge of an operating agency is not to just do the same thing every day, because you've got to do something every single day. So how do you think beyond that? Well, you need people who do that for a living. So the automated screening lanes are one example of some things that we can do that can dramatically begin to transform the system. As I said, there's real friction in this system. I mean, I slide my bag along a table, and and I'm usually sliding everybody else's bag along the table because they've already gone through the system, and I've got to get it through. So I said, there's already, this is existing technology. The Europeans have been using it for some time. So we approached the airlines. We came through A4A, and we said, look, the way, you know how the federal procurement process works and the federal acquisition rules are, it's going to be 28 years before I can do this myself. So if anybody's interested, I got an idea. And to the great credit of the industry, they've stepped forward and have begun to think about a public-private partnership where they contract, they get it in place, and then we maintain it over time. So we've got, currently there are 2 lanes that have been installed down in Atlanta Hartsfield, but I know that there's work being done. So that was Delta purchased those 2. United is working on transforming the Newark terminal. American Airlines has announced that they intend to put a significant number of these in some of their major hub terminals, and in fact are going to be, have announced that they would prototype some computed topology screening. So this is a CT scanners that we use currently in checked baggage for the checkpoint. All of that means that we have a potential to move things faster. So we looked at the count, the total potential count, and you could see as many as 60 such automated screening lanes by the end of this calendar year, as many as 150 or so by the middle of next summer. Again, that's a potential count. It's not a guaranteed. And what we've tried to do is put a team together that can then work collectively and begin to incubate these public-private sector ideas. We also put an announcement out, what's called a broad agency announcement, which simply says, hey, we're open to some ideas. And we got a significant number of responses to that. And we're going through that, 81 good responses. You get a lot of kind of wacky responses too, laser beams from outer space. But we got a lot of good responses that show great promise. And we've hired a consulting team to come in and help us really think through the whole ecosystem, if you will, of security from reservation to destination. So not just the passenger stream, but the cargo stream, and then who are all the players that interact, so that you think of it as not just, hey, I only own the checkpoint and you guys got that thing over here. So how do you think of it as a system and then begin to disaggregate some of what's really tightly aggregated around the checkpoint and begin to distribute those elements more effectively? So I think the most exciting thing that we are potentially doing is this innovation idea, and opening ourselves up to the idea, to the possibility to change, and change dramatically. And then to not worry about whether you can do it everywhere. Do it in the places you can do it, and see what, and do, kind of the rolling development and rolling transformation. Because you have an enemy that evolves very rapidly, and we want to evolve faster than the enemy does.
Well, I see our time has run out, and I think transformation is a good place to end. So thank you all.